You have a whole minute. You don't want to disappoint anybody. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Oasis. My name's Eileen Flory, and we are the Timbercrest Memoir Writing Group here to read for you today. I'm not sure we need all that much of an introduction. We've been honored to read for our friends and neighbors a number of times before. In fact, this is our second time this year. All I want to say, well, I do want to mention that one difference between last time and now is that we are without our dear member, Grace Voorhees. But one thing I wanted to make sure to do was issue an invitation to you to join us if you'd like. If you like to think about your memories, if you like to write, we would love to have anybody join us. We always have a good time. And sometimes we laugh a lot, sometimes we shed a tear, but that's what memories are all about, isn't it? So one by one, we will read our pieces to you after introducing ourselves. Carol will begin.
My name is Carol Burkett, and I would like to read about my favorite summer experience. The launch of the Russian satellite Sputnik had a lot to do with one of the most interesting and enjoyable summers I can ever remember. What's the connection, you ask? Well, even if you don't, I'll tell you. It was during the Cold War that Russia rocketed to the lead with the launch of Sputnik, a basketball-sized satellite. It was the first man-made object to orbit the Earth. In an effort to compete in the space race, one of the ways the U.S. attempted to do this was to send science teachers back to school to get more education in science. Since my husband Paul taught physics as well as other science courses, he was eligible to apply for grants to take more science courses. He applied several places, but the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington, was the place he chose. Thank goodness. So that summer, we packed up our small camper and with our 3 small boys headed for Seattle. Since we lived in such cramped quarters, we spent most of our time outdoors. The boys made friends with the other kids in the trailer court, and there were lots of interesting things to do and see while Paul was in class. One highlight was the Seattle Seafair. It was an annual festival. It included a parade complete with pirates. We also got to go up in the Space Needle to see the 4th of July fireworks, but they were a little bit small because they were so far below us. Paul decided to sell the camper in Seattle at the end of the summer. I wasn't much for the idea, as I envisioned our 3 boys plus all the contents of our trailer in our car on the way home. But he prevailed, and we sold the camper to a nice young Italian-American family with the agreement that we would stay in the camper until Paul was done with classes. They even had us over for a spaghetti dinner. Several weeks later, we decided to take our camper out to the Olympic Peninsula over the weekend. We could hear the Pacific Ocean crashing against the rocks below our campsite. We loved the experience so much that Paul suggested that the boys and I could stay there all week, and then he would come and get us the following weekend. It just so happened that during the week when the boys and I were on the Olympic Peninsula, that the man who bought our camper drove past the trailer court and saw that our camper was gone. I imagine he was rather upset as he had paid for all or most of it. He thought he had been taken, but eventually learned that we had been camping elsewhere that week. So it all came to a happy ending, except for the trip home. It was as bad or worse than I had envisioned. Our car was so overloaded that I had to carry the pet turtle in a bowl on my lap all the way back to Indiana. But it was all worth it for the wonderful summer we had in Seattle.
I'm going to read about a total eclipse. In July of 1991, the Science Museum of Minnesota, where I worked, sponsored, along with the Minnesota Astronomical Society, a trip to La Paz, Baja California, to see a total eclipse of the sun. About 120 members from both organizations had signed up for the experience, and the head of our museum's continuing education department needed to find 5 museum employees to help shepherd all those people. Dave had lined up himself and 3 others from his department, but none of them spoke any Spanish. So he came around one day to ask me, who worked in a different department but spoke Spanish and had experience in Mexico, to go on the trip. I was reluctant to go. I just couldn't see myself in Baja California in July with hordes of outsiders flocking in for the event. And anyway, the idea of an eclipse didn't do that much for me. But my friend Dave was desperate, literally on his knees by my desk, begging me to go. I realized then and there that I had some leverage. I found the presence of mind to extract from him the promise of something I had already been thinking about, an opportunity to go on a junket of the type offered to travel agents by operators in tourist destinations, which Science Museum and continuing education staff sometimes took advantage of. I smiled sweetly and told him I was up for going anywhere. With Dave still kneeling on the floor, the deal was made. As soon as we arrived in La Paz and settled into our hotel, I realized what my main job was going to be. Believe it or not, nobody at the hotel spoke English. It was a modest place catering to Mexican tourists. The city of La Paz leaves it to Los Cabos to serve gringos wanting fancier accommodations. Had I thought ahead, I would have created a cheat sheet to distribute with some Spanish vocabulary and sentences such as, "Can I please have another towel?" for use with hotel staff. As it was, I was constantly peppered with requests of all kinds and tried my best to be on the spot as much as I could. Things calmed down after a couple of days, but I was still the go-to troubleshooter, a role I kind of enjoyed. The museum had planned its trip so that the eclipse itself came halfway through the 9 days we were to be there. The period of totality was predicted to be an unusually long 7 minutes, making this a once-in-a-lifetime experience for those who cared about such things. From the outset, the hardcore amateur astronomers lived for the eclipse, going out every night to test their telescopes and cameras and to compare notes with each other. They slept late, while the rest of us enjoyed jaunts to beaches and islands around the tip of the Baja Peninsula. For me, it was a chance to be a tourist in a country where I had always had some sort of business to accomplish on my visits. I was still on the clock, but was able to devote some part of my mind to simply enjoying myself. Things were looking up. David rented an old VW bus to take small groups of trip participants on informal excursions. One day, I drew driving duty to an outlying village where artisans were working and selling their wares, right up my alley. Several museum people and astronomers piled in, and I started up the bus for my first time driving it. I put it into first gear, signaled, and pulled away from the curb into La Paz traffic, only to discover that the bus was missing second gear. In the rearview mirror, I spied Dave on the sidewalk, laughing and pointing at me as I fished around in the gearbox, holding up traffic. Of course, if he had bothered to tell me about the missing gear, I could easily have skipped it. But I already knew that my friend Dave had a little mean streak in him. Eclipse Day dawned hot and clear. The museum had arranged to gather in the playground of a Catholic school, so we made our way over there a couple of hours in advance. Amateur astronomers fiddled with their telescopes. Nuns in black habits gathered with their families and friends, and the rest of us stood around chatting, looking forward to the eclipse. A reporter for the St. Paul Pioneer Press, who had come down to join us for a couple of days, busily interviewed people and jotted down notes. Someone announced that first contact had been made, the moment when the moon takes its first nip at the sun's edge. Everyone watched as the eclipse progressed, we gringos sharing with the sisters in their crowd the rectangles of dark welder's glass that we had each been issued. Somewhere in a landfill, there's a tape recording of me explaining to one of the sisters how to use the glass safely. A few of us were just as captivated by the shadows cast by palm fronds on the black top. They showed two parallel rows of bright little eclipses where each blade narrowed as it attached to the frond's stem, forming openings that acted like pinhole cameras. I hope you can visualize that. Then the air cooled and stilled, and we watched a tsunami of a shadow sweep toward us, announcing that totality was near. When the moment came, we took down the welder's glass to view the silvery corona that spread out from the black sun. People cheered and cameras whirred in the dark. As for me, I got kind of dizzy, but was nevertheless glad to be there in that instant. Later that day, when the reporter had put the finishing touches on his piece, I drove him in that VW bus quite smoothly to the long-distance phone office so he could file his story. He seemed to know something about the process connecting laptop computer to newspaper office, although it took us a while to actually make it work. When I read the article back home, I saw he had quoted a sister and me, each of us saying predictable things, neither of us able to capture in words the reality of the experience. For the rest of our time on the Baja Peninsula, we could all relax and spend our days and nights seeing more sights in the sky, land, and sea. I even acquired a bit of an interest in astronomy as the aficionados shared their telescopes, knowledge, and enthusiasm. I was grateful that Dave and I had come to an agreement that day with him on his knees in my office. As it turned out, when the time came for him to make good on his promise to send me on a freebie junket, he went me one better, but that's for another story.
A weekend in October 2023. Here we were, sitting in pouring rain. Yes, I was bundled up with a long sleeve shirt, warm pants, a thick sweater, a heavy coat, and a big hooded poncho with a seat cushion attached. My daughter Sally, beside me, had an umbrella, as many around us did. What would we be doing, sitting here in the rain on a cold Friday evening in October? And there were a lot of us, too. Some didn't sit much. They jumped up and down at times, and the young ones did a lot of walking. You guessed it. We were at a high school football game. And why was I, at this age, at one of those in the stands? A granddaughter, of course. No, she's not on the football team, which, by the way, were all wearing bright pink socks. It was Breast Cancer Awareness Week. And when not on the field, the team members were using ponchos that matched the color of the one I wore. They were a deep maroon, the color of the home team. Vienna is a cheerleader, one of 25 to 30 girls and some guys who bounced in front of their classmates, yelling cheers for long minutes. They too were wearing ponchos, but theirs were opaque pink, which allowed us to see their pink sweatshirts inside. Vienna's shirt had a deep pink hood, making it easy to find her in the crowd. At the time, Vienna Marguerite Willoughby was a 16-year-old junior at Granville High School near Grand Rapids, Michigan. She also plays soccer, lacrosse, and cello, as well as cheering. The rain continued through Saturday morning, but my journey with Sally to Brethren, Michigan, ended in sunshine. The leaves had started turning, but weren't yet as vivid and bright as I had hoped. The purpose of going to Brethren, besides seeing many old friends from our days as pastor there, was to attend the dedication ceremony of the two large statues of James Earl Jones and his mentor, Donald Crouch, at Brethren High School. James Earl Jones attended Brethren High School in the 1950s and overcame stuttering by reciting poetry in Reverend Crouch's class. My own children attended and graduated from Brethren High School in the 70s and 80s. And you can see my picture of the statues and read about the event in the March 2024 Church of the Brethren Messenger magazine. Back to Grand Rapids on Sunday afternoon found me in the stands again, but this time it was just a bit windy. I still needed my winter coat and hat, but no poncho. Now, granddaughter Shiloh Autumn Willoughby, a freshman, was playing fullback on the high school girls rugby team. This is not her favorite position, but she does score points and prevents others from making points for the opposing team. Shiloh turned 15 on October 30. Her best sport is soccer, where she is a high scorer. Shiloh also plays basketball and anything else she feels like doing, even sand soccer. Both Vienna and Shiloh were adopted as tiny Black infants, and we are so glad to have them in our family. My images of this fall weekend are a rare treat because I seldom get to see my youngest grandchildren play sports in person.
I'm Joanne Schall, and my story is my lifeguarding experience. Summertime meant swimming in my 10 to 17-year-old world. I could ride my bike from Laketon to the mile or so to Long Lake and swim almost every summer day. In early summer, there were swimming lessons conducted by Red Cross volunteers from Wabash, with many afternoons spent practicing in the water with friends or enjoying play, racing, playing hide and seek, playing king of the raft, until a lifeguard stopped us from the fun of pushing each other off the rafts. Swimming lessons usually lasted for 2 weeks. Each summer, I learned new strokes and became more proficient. But when I was 16, there was only one class left to take, life saving. I didn't want to be a lifeguard, but it was the only class left and I signed up for it. In the life-saving class, we learned we should row, throw, or go when someone was in trouble. If we were in a boat, we should swiftly row to them to help them. If we could, we should throw a life-saving ring to them. As a last resort, we could go to them, swim to them, to help them. The class focused on how to help if we had to swim to a rescue. We learned to manipulate a panicked person into a position where we could swim away with him. His back to us, our left arm across his shoulder and under his right arm, his head nestled between our shoulders and necks, so we could do a side stroke and head the person to shallow water. We also swam laps around the 3 rafts to gain the strength we would need to effect a rescue. Earning the coveted Red Cross life-saving badge depended on 2 things: swimming 25 laps around the 3 rafts and showing competency in a simulated rescue situation. At 16, I was able to do both. The rescue was difficult, but the person volunteering to be rescued was light and cooperative. I earned my badge. At 18, I had a choice. I could review my badge by repeating the course and the testing, or I could walk away from the whole thing. I still loved the water, so I repeated the course. This time, things were harder. I needed the practice to handle the laps, but we were allowed to use any stroke we wanted, and that saved me. I wasn't good at the Australian crawl. It's called the freestyle now. Although that was what we should do in a rescue, swimming toward the person, head out of the water, eyes glued to the victim. But to swim around the rafts, I could also do the breaststroke, side stroke, backstroke, or even the frog-like elementary backstroke. And I used the whole menu. The instructor saw that I could swim the required distance, so that test was managed. For the renewal of the life-saving badge, we had to demonstrate a rescue, this time at Lucan's Lake. I was less familiar with this than Long Lake, but it was a similar setting. When we got into the water, the instructor introduced us to our volunteer victim. My heart sank. This time, I was to rescue a thick-bodied, muscle-bound Wabash High School football player. When my turn came, he struggled in the water. I dived in to come up behind him, and he twisted around and grabbed his arms around my neck, as a real victim might do. I did the practice moves, but they didn't work. We sank into the water together, with his vice-like grip refusing to lessen, and my kicks and turns having little effect. I was near panic, although I knew the instructor was watching the water churn and would not let us drown. Eventually, we both came up for air, and I whirled him into position and rescued him. I was exhausted and not proud of my efforts. The others in the class had more success, although this strong man gave his best attempts to defeat them. At the end of the morning, the instructor called me aside. With a concerned expression, she said she would renew my life-saving badge, but I shouldn't try to rescue anyone over the age of 10. I immediately saw myself swimming to a struggling person and asking him how old he was. But the image faded, and I thanked the instructor. I never wore that badge, knowing that attempting a rescue would be death for both the swimmer and me. That summer, I had a lifeguard duty at 4-H camp with a real lifeguard. And several years later, I had lifeguard duty with other counselors at a Jewish camp where I worked. Fortunately for everyone, I never had to row, throw, or go. We all survived my lifeguard experience.
I'm Wendy Mesker, and I'm going to read two. One's very short, but they're both about gardening. The first one I titled Those Garden Seeds. Ruth, Julia Ann, Evelyn, Olive, and Grace would never have met except they married brothers and lived within a 5-mile radius of each other. Their family names were Landis, Floor, Mishler, Miller, and Hoover, and then all are Metzger. In late winter, these 5 sisters-in-law gathered to combine their garden seed orders to facilitate buying their seeds in bulk. When they gathered, there were no husbands and no children present. As a child, I was intrigued about this meeting. To my memory, it was the only time they congregated without spouses and/or children. Once the garden seeds were ordered and had arrived, another time was scheduled. This time, they gathered with small food scales, postal scales, envelopes, small bags, and markers to divide the seeds. My only peek into these evenings happened when it was my mother's turn to host. We children were already sent to bed in our rooms, but because my bedroom was at the top of the stairs with no door, I was able to do some eavesdropping before sleep prevailed. I heard lots of laughter, waves of conversation, and frustratingly, some words too quiet to make out. And there were refreshments. I didn't know of any other instances where these women, who I defined as mothers and wives, congregated without their children and spouses. As I matured, the significance of the camaraderie these women had seems truly amazing. 5 very different women thrown into a close relationship by virtue of marrying brothers. I applaud them for making this relationship work. This one's called gardening. While growing up, Mom had a large garden. I don't know its size, but I'm guessing it was a little over a half acre. I just know it seemed huge to me as a child. She needed a garden this big in order to preserve sufficient vegetables to feed a family of 8 for a year. Dad's part was the prep, which included spreading manure on it, plowing it, and disking it. And if he wasn't busy farming, he would also help run the rototiller. I remember lettuce, radishes, peas, green beans, lima beans, onions, peppers, tomatoes, butternut squash, marigolds, and zinnias. My memory is that Dad, not Mom, planted and harvested the cantaloupe, and the sweet corn was planted on the outer rows of the cornfield. Sometimes I was allowed to help plant the garden. I remember Mom finding a small stick the length she wanted, and I could put in a seed in the furrow, space the seeds by using the length of that stick, and then put in another seed. When I was quite small, Mom would have me walk heel to toe in the furrow after she covered the seed with soil so that it could be tamped down. When a vegetable was ready to harvest, Mom would get up at the first sign of daylight and start picking. She would stop to fix the family breakfast, then go back to picking. It was all hands on deck, or in our case, all hands on the back patio, for the business of shelling peas, or shelling lima beans, or snapping green beans, or silking corn, or chopping tomatoes. We children didn't have a choice whether to help. It was an expectation. Mom sweetened the process by paying us a small amount for each quart we did. I remember 10 cents per quart for shelled peas, 5 cents per quart for snap green beans, and 7 cents per quart for shelled lima beans. This incentive kept us going throughout the morning as the cash augmented our allowance significantly. On days with an especially large harvest, one or both grandmothers came to help. A grandmother's help was a mixed blessing, for they worked quickly and steadfastly, so the job was completed much quicker. But they also decreased my revenue potential. Several years I enrolled in gardening as a 4-H project. At judging time, Mom helped me find the best display, which often involved multiple samples of different vegetables. I sometimes felt that Mom took the judges' comments more seriously and personally than I did. We also had a strawberry patch, and once again, we were financially compensated for each quart we picked. One sister really didn't want to pick strawberries one summer, but it was expected of us. She managed to connect enough extension cords to get a radio at the edge of the strawberry patch so she could bear the chore while listening to the top 40 hits. A fond memory is getting off the school bus, dumping my books on the kitchen table, grabbing a salt shaker, and heading to the tomato patch. I still cherish the memory of a sun-warmed tomato in one hand, the salt shaker in the other, juice dripping off my chin, and the salty, tangy flavor filling my mouth. Now I am the gardener. I learned through generational knowledge. I like playing in the dirt. I like smelling the turning over dirt. I like the hoping and waiting for the seeds to sprout. Harvesting is rewarding, but the ultimate enjoyment is eating the produce when it's fresh and throughout the year. And then there are the weeds. I don't remember seeing weeds in Mom's garden. Weeding is a part of gardening I do not enjoy. However, the weed-free look, like Mom's, is what I strive for. Each winter, as the seed catalogs arrive, I begin the dreaming and planning process for the next garden. My intention each spring is to have a weed-free garden this time. I try new seeds. Some vegetables produce abundantly, some may not thrive, and always there are weeds. Thank you for coming today. Yes, thank you for joining us.